Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Termite Myths and Lies, brought to you by Pest Management Professional Magazine and our sponsor of the event, Control Solutions, Inc. I'm Danielle Pesta from North Coast Media, the Senior Digital Media Manager for Pest Management Professional. I will be your event manager for today's presentation. At this time, I'd like to get you comfortable with our console and the ways which you can participate. Please notice the Q&A panel on the right-hand side of your console. If you have a question, type it in the panel's text box, then click Submit to place your question in queue. You may also use the hashtag PMPWebinar on Twitter to submit questions during the event or just to enter into discussions with other attendees. We encourage you to ask and enter any questions you may have for our speaker during the presentation, and we will address these questions at the end during the Q&A portion. Any questions already submitted during registration have already gone to our speaker and may be covered during the presentation. If you experience any technical difficulties, you may also use that same Q&A panel on your screen to submit your issue. Alan Wagner, our technical support specialist, or I will personally assist you. Finally, you may learn more about today's speaker by viewing their photo, bio, and contact information in the panel located in the upper right-hand corner of your console. Free continuing education unit credits are available for today's webinar. Here are a few reminders before getting started. To earn credit today, your state must be eligible and you must have indicated during registration that you were attending the webinar for credit and include your license number. If you are unsure if you made that indication or provided your number, please email your license number to Trinity at trinitybrennesser@controlsolutionsinc.com before the webinar begins today. Her email is visible on the current slide. Those based in New York and New Jersey are also required to email Trinity a photo of themselves and their driver's license or state ID before the webinar begins today. The states eligible for CEUs are listed in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen or on the main registration page. To earn credit, you must attend today's webinar for the full duration. Anyone who attends the webinar on demand will not be eligible for credit. Finally, you must attend the webinar and sign in from your own device. You will not be eligible for CEU credit if you are viewing the webinar with someone else who used their login to register. Now, I'd like to introduce today's speaker. Today, we will be hearing from Heather Patterson. Heather is a PCO Technical Service Manager for Control Solutions, Inc. In her current role, Heather works with university researchers and industry cooperators to test products and build data packages. She also supports CSI's sales and marketing teams and the pest management industry on behalf of CSI. She earned her bachelor's and master's degrees in entomology and a specialization in urban pest management from the University of Florida. During her time as a student, she conducted research on bedbugs, cockroaches, and mosquitoes. Following her time at UF, she joined CSI and gained several years of product development experience as a project manager on the R&D team. At this time, I'll turn the presentation over to you, Heather. Take it away.
Thank you, Danielle. Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on what part of the world you're joining us from. I'm Heather Patterson, Technical Services at Control Solutions, and I'm very thankful to be here presenting today's Termite CEU. I know some of you guys may not be joining necessarily for any CEU credits, and we're still glad to have you here in attendance as well. My goal, hopefully you learned something new that you didn't know before about termites, or maybe this presentation can help bolster your understanding of these pests and how to manage them. As she mentioned, I'm going to be talking about some of the common myths and lies that you may have heard about termites, and talk about some of the misconceptions that you may even had at one point in your life or your career about termites and termite control. So let's go ahead and get started. Looking at today's agenda, I didn't want to give any spoilers about the exact myths and lies that we'll be talking about. But as I work my way through the slides, we're going to be touching on a number of topics like termite taxonomy. We'll talk a little bit about biology and their behaviors, termite feeding habits and what that means from a control standpoint. We'll take a look at some very obvious termite damage that you probably have seen before in your career. And then, of course, spend some time discussing the various tools, methods, and tactics that we have available to us to manage termites. This is going to be a fact-checking mission, a myth-busting mission, all about termites. But before we get to myth number one, I do like to start things off with the good old trusty Merriam-Webster definition. So I like to ask myself, like to ask the audience, what is a myth? Or what makes a myth a myth? And it has an element of falsehood. Myths are going to be stories or tales or folklore that gets passed along from person to person or generation to generation. Myths are going to be a widely held but typically false belief. Sometimes we hear a myth and we don't ever really question its accuracy, but like I said, it's that falsehood that truly makes it a myth. So myth number one, the first myth we're going to talk about in today's presentation is termites are white ants. This is one you've probably heard before, and I'll admit this is one that I had repeated probably on more than one occasion before I became an entomologist, because it's an easy comparison to make, but it doesn't mean it's accurate. And that is a good illustration for myths in general, kind of why they cling on and stand the test of time, and they're not really questioned. It's just information we hear or we read, and we accept it sometimes and pass it along, but it doesn't mean it's always correct. So that, of course, is not true. Ants and termites are both very important pests in our industry, and there are some similarities and parallels that we can draw between these two insect groups, especially if we're talking about their social behaviors or their colony structure. But the reality is these two groups of insects are not very closely related on the phylogenetic tree within the class Insecta. Right? So we know that termites are old organisms. They're very primitive, old on that evolutionary timeline, where ants are younger on that evolutionary timeline. We consider ants to be more evolved and more derived organisms. Ants have that unique pupal stage that all holometabolous insects have, and we don't see that with termites. So if you were to observe a termite swarm happening at the same time with ants and termites, and you snatched two out of the air and you looked at them side by side, you would notice some pretty distinct differences between the two. Things that we're trained to look for pretty early on in our career, or if this is an aspect of entomology that we're interested in. We need to look at the wing length if they are alates. Termites are going to have two wings of equal length, where the ant alate is going to have a hind wing and a forewing of different lengths. Another thing that we're trained to look for is the body shape. Ants are going to have that threaded or thin waist, where termites are going to have a more chunky body shape. And then, of course, the antennae. Ants have, excuse me, those characteristically elbowed antennae, also known as geniculate antennae, where termites, theirs are going to be much more straight and resemble a string of beads. Those are known as maniliform. So there's some obvious differences between these two. So, of course, yes, termites are not ants. Of course, they are actually closely related to another insect group. Believe it or not, they're closely related to cockroaches. Talk about a downgrade on the family tree. Yes, termites are related to cockroaches. They're so closely related through scientific evidence and DNA analysis. We've determined that termites actually ought to be lumped in the same order as the cockroaches, and that's the order Blatodia. Now, I know I don't want to spend too much time on taxonomy. It's not everybody's favorite subject, but I do want to clarify some things. When we mention the word order, what does that really mean? If you're not sure, I'm hoping to kind of clarify that here. Orders are a great way to kind of describe these general groups of insects that we talk about. For instance, all of the beetle species are going to be in the order Coleoptera. All of the earwig species are in the order Dermaptera. All of the flies in the order Diptera. And so when I was going to school, I learned that cockroaches had their own order, and that was the order Blatodia, and termites were in their own order Isoptera. Well, since they're so closely related, we've actually done away with the order Isoptera and have grouped them together, like I mentioned, with the cockroaches in the order Blatodia. We consider termites to be fancy social cockroaches in many ways. So how did they decide this? They, as the scientists and researchers that made the decision to do away with Isoptera and lump them together with the cockroaches in the order Blatodia. Well, it was done through numerous phylogenetic testing, DNA analysis, over 107 different species of insects, including cockroaches, termites, and mantids. Those were investigated pretty closely. That, in conjunction with the shared morphological traits and physiological traits, justified the grouping of cockroaches and termites together in the same order. When I mentioned morphological traits, those are that describes like the form, the shape, and the structure of an organism, and physiological traits describe like the functions and systems within the organism. So what are some of those traits? Well, they both have very similar gut symbionts that they depend on to help break down the cellulose in their diet. Both cockroaches and termites also produce this glue-like secretion. They use it for different reasons and different purposes. Cockroaches will use that glue-like secretion to attach their ootheca or egg case to various surfaces. If you've ever dealt with an American cockroach infestation in a garage or shed or wherever, you may have seen those ootheca attached to picture frames, boxes, and a variety of other things. And that's how they're using that glue that they produce. And kind of different for termites, they're using those glue-like secretions to help construct their mud tubes and their shelter tubes, which, if you've ever inspected closely, are pretty structurally sound. Now, of course, there are some differences between these two insect groups. We know that cockroaches contain their eggs in a hardened case. This rigid hardened case is an ootheca. And sometimes, depending on the species, these ootheca can contain anywhere between 8 to upwards of 20 or 30 developing cockroach embryos. This is a trait that was lost in termites. It's not something that's very necessary because you think about a termite colony, drying out isn't really a concern, right? They're in these much more stable underground environments. They're receiving brood care from their nest mates. And so that's not a concern for a young developing termite. So how did we get from cockroaches to termites? What did that pathway to sociality actually look like? Well, we know termites aren't the only social insect that we deal with in pest management. Other social insects that we manage and deal with include things like ants, wasps, bees, and there's a number of shared traits that they all have to have in order to be classified as a social insect. You know, all of these insects are living in nests or colonies together, but the three key features that they have is one, overlapping generations. Two is there's division of labor. So you have your reproductive individuals in the colony, and then you also have your non-reproductives that are responsible for foraging, for defending the colony, for taking care of the brood, and also helping to take care of the reproductives themselves. And then the third key feature of a social insect is that cooperative brood care. Everybody's chipping in to help take care of the next generation, to help take care of the young. So we don't consider cockroaches to be truly social insects. However, there are some examples of what we call communal cockroaches that exhibit some level of semi-social behaviors, because there are some species that do offer parental care either to the egg or their offspring, which is quite unusual for cockroaches and insects in general outside of the social ones. Another trait that potentially led to this sociality from cockroaches to termites is proctidial trophallaxis. Now, I mentioned they both depend on gut microbes to help with digestion of their diet. And in many cases, that has to be obtained through sharing food with their nestmates. And when it comes to proctidial trophallaxis specifically, it's best not to ask where your food came from. Just be glad that you got a hot meal. But we are here to learn, so we're going to talk about it. So trophallaxis is the exchange of food between two individuals or two nestmates. And termites do this in two different ways. They could share food via stomodial trophallaxis, which is mouth-to-mouth sharing of food, or they can share food via proctidial trophallaxis, which is mouth to rear. Now, we know when termites are molting, they shed their exoskeleton. It's not just their outside shell that they lose or they shed. There's actually parts of their internal systems that go with it and parts of their gut lining as well. And so it's really important, it's critical for these insects in order to survive, to replenish those gut microbes. And this is how they do that, by sharing food with their nestmates in these two ways. As PMPs, when we talk about cockroaches, we're inclined to think about species that are structure invading, right? The German cockroaches, American cockroaches, and it can be somewhat arguably hard to see the similarity between those species and termites. But there's somewhere around over 3,000 different cockroach species, and a very small percentage of all those species are considered pests of structures or structure invading cockroach species. And it's really the ones, specifically the woods cockroaches, where we start to see those similarities. Cockroaches that live really peculiar and interesting lives, living in underground or subterranean galleries, very similar to a termite. I think there's a lot of fascinating termite trivia. We're going to talk about how old these organisms are, where they show up on the geological timescale. But fossil evidence has shown that these are the first organisms to show mutualism. Mutualism does describe a relationship between two organisms that benefit from that relationship with each other. And in the case of the termite, it's the termite and its relationship with those gut microbes. It depends on those gut microbes to help with the digestion of cellulose, which is a really complex, very difficult material to digest. And that's exactly what the microbes do. They transform it into a more digestible form for the termite. And of course, the microbes benefit by being in the termite body. They're not going to be found existing outside of it. There's several examples, insect examples of mutualism too, that you probably have observed before. For instance, between ants and aphids, right? Ants love to feed on those sugary honeydew secretions produced by aphids, and in return, aphids get protection from the ants. Ants got to protect those tasty little crocodile treats from their aphid friends. So the truth behind this myth is no, termites are not white ants. They're not really even closely related to ants. And as we just learned, they're actually closely related to cockroaches, so much so that they have been grouped into the order Blatodia right alongside them. Hopping along to myth number 2, termites are only pests. The only purpose they serve is to feed on and destroy man-made homes and structures. What do we think about this one? Well, that's not true. That is indeed false. Termites are considered largely to be beneficial insects. They're beneficial organisms that play a very important ecological role in nature. When we talk about beneficial insects, we don't typically think of termites. They're not the first to come to mind. We're typically going to think of the more glamorous types, the honeybees that are responsible for pollinating our flowers and our crops. Sometimes we'll think of things like ladybugs, pictured here, or assassin bugs that will predate on and suppress pest populations in our gardens. Sometimes we'll even think of things like spiders that will feed on unwanted critters around the home. But yeah, we don't typically think of termites, but they are beneficial because they're very important decomposers of wood. And yes, that sometimes includes the wood that we use to build our structure. But when we're talking about that role in nature, it's really important to have an organism that can effectively break down that material and return it to the earth in a more nutritious form. Very important for the ecosystem and the habitats in which they live. So we discussed termites being very important decomposers. They're very important nutrient recyclers. When a tree falls in the forest, something's got to move in to break it down, right? So you have termites that'll come in. You'll have various fungi species that'll start to take over to break down that tree. But they're not the only organisms that have the ability to do this, the ability to consume and digest cellulose. Who else or what other kind of animals can? Well, cows, sheep, goat, elk, bison, deer. And there's a common thread that runs among all of these organisms, and that's the fact that they're classified as ruminant animals. Ruminants are these very large hooved herbivorous grazing animals. And they have these very complex digestive systems, multi-chamber stomachs, and one of those chambers is called a rumen, hence their name, ruminant. And in that rumen, much like a termite, they also have microbes that help with the breakdown of cellulose. So when you think about it like a goat going along or deer that's feeding on the grass and vegetation and weeds, they're going to come across and consume woody vegetation as well. And it's really important that they have those gut microbes to help break that material down. So we talked about their role in breaking down dead trees and cellulose, but those aren't the only other beneficial roles that termites play in the environments in which they live. Termites also will aerate the soil during their tunneling activities. If you are a golfer or a lawn care nut or a gardener, you hopefully understand the importance of aeration. Aeration reduces compaction. It allows the soil to reoxygenate, which is really important for plant health and root health. The roots have a better ability to work its way through the soil when it's aerated. And also it helps with nutrient uptake. Plants are much more effective at taking up nutrients when the soil is aerated. In addition to this, as termites are metabolizing cellulose and feeding on wood, their byproducts returns to the soil in a more nutritious form. We do know that termite frass, their excrement or poop, is really high in magnesium, which is an important nutrient that helps with plant growth and health. So when do termites become a pest? When are they no longer a part of nature and they've crossed over to pest status? Well, let's define pest. That's going to be a living organism that's living, breeding, thriving, and surviving in places where we don't want it to live, breed, thrive, and survive. You may like a sunflower in your garden, but if it's growing in the middle of a golf course green, we got a problem. It's a pest there. So when it happens with termites, it's pretty obvious. They don't know they're a pest. They're just going along, eating wood to meet their biological needs. But when that wood happens to be part of some of our most expensive investments, like our house or our place of business, landscape timbers or trees in our yard, that's when it becomes a problem. And so speaking of trees, you can see that image on the left side. That is it's been attacked by Formosan subterranean termites, and they're known to do this, get into a live tree and feed on the center of it. And when you think about where you find Formosan subterranean termites around the country, you're going to get big storms and sometimes hurricanes in those parts. And it makes these trees that have been attacked this way very vulnerable and susceptible to falling over and crashing on top of cars or houses or people. So pretty obvious when termites become a pest and affect our lives. Other benefits of termites, they are a very important part of the food chain. They're a food source for a lot of the animals that hopefully we care about, like chimps, orangutans pictured here, birds, bats, moles, lizards, all sorts of things feed on termites. There's also a lot of humans and countries around the world that practice entomophagy, which is the practice of eating insects, and they'll feed on these nutritious little creatures. Now, that's not something that we practice very much here in the United States or North America or Europe, but there are many countries that do. And I feel like it's a topic that's growing in popularity. I feel like I'm seeing much more media reporting and articles on the topic of entomophagy. Take a look at this silhouette here. At first glance, it kind of looks like a creature you'd see on Star Wars or Harry Potter, but it very much is an animal that you have seen before. It's the giant anteater. The giant anteater is native to Central and South America, and she's truly huge. These creatures can get up to 7 feet or more in length. If you take a look at her feet, she has bear-like feet with very long claws. Her claws are so long that she actually has to walk on her knuckles. And she uses those claws like tools. They're 4-inch claws, and she'll dig at that hard mound material in order to access the food within it that she's after. So in addition to her claws, she has another tool. It's a very long, very sensitive nose. It's a 18-inch long termite detector. And it's so sensitive that it can actually distinguish what species of termites lives in the mounds that she's visiting. Okay, and that's really important because the giant anteater has relatively poor eyesight. So termites are going to be her meal of choice, that in conjunction with ants. And so when she finds a termite mound and she's ready to eat, she'll peel back that mound material with her claws, she'll stick her snout in there, and then she uses her 2-foot-long tongue to worm its way through like a cowboy's whip in the tunnels, in the galleries, and will slurp up termites like ramen noodles. I think it's somewhere around 35,000 insects she will eat on an average day. That's way more anteater facts than you probably want or expected in today's presentations, but we're talking about the benefits of termites. And I think it's not very first nature for us in this industry to think of those redeeming qualities or positive attributes about a lot of the pests that we deal with, including termites. But when we're talking about the benefits of termites, interesting creatures like the giant anteater, she truly depends on them for survival. And I think we can value that. So the truth behind this myth is, yes, termites are absolutely major pests that we deal with, and they can cause a lot of destruction. But many pests do play very important, very beneficial roles in the environments in which they live. Okay, myth number 3. Termites can chew through and consume brick, stone, and mortar. What do we think about this one? That's not true, and thank goodness that they can't, don't, and won't eat brick, stone, and mortar. I always like to throw in a bonus question here. Have you ever heard of a gastrolith? Do you know what a gastrolith is? Gastroliths are going to be stones that are swallowed by some animals like fish, birds, and reptiles, and they use those gastroliths in their gizzards to help with the digestion of food. Now, you think about the jaws of something like an alligator or a bird, you know, they're swallowing their food whole. They don't have molars like we do where we can grind our food down into small bits. And so the gastrolith is in the gizzard or the crop of the animal, helping to break those large food chunks down into more digestible bits. So I say all this because we don't think of stones in any case being an acceptable food source for any animal, but there are some interesting examples in nature where they are eaten. For the case of termites, they're not. But it can be a little misleading, especially if we're dealing with a situation like this where We have someone who's convinced that they have photo evidence of termites that are damaging their brick or their stone or their mortar around their home. And so we see in this image here that these subterranean termites have built their shelter material, their tubes along the mortar lines in this brick, but they're not feeding on the mortar. What's likely happened in this situation is that they've located an entryway, a hole, or a gap that they're using to get within the structure. They're after the wood. That's what they're really going for. And so if we see them in these spaces, tunneling there or building their nest, their shelter tubes there does not imply consumption. And when we look at the termites' mouth parts and their mandibles, we can start to understand why they're not quite capable of consuming and chewing and breaking through this incredibly hard material. You can see this soft, squishy termite worker here. And even though her body is soft bodied, she does have very well developed, very rigid mandibles that are made of tough exoskeleton. I mean, chewing through wood in and of itself isn't necessarily an easy job, but they're by no means strong enough to chew through and consume stone, brick, and mortar. So if you think about the slide that we saw previously, they may be using their mouth parts to move little bits of crumbled mortar or little bits of crumbled brick, but they're not feeding on them, right? They're typically doing that because what they want to do is create a small opening to gain access to the structure, to gain access to the wood within it, behind the brick or stone veneer. And all they need is 1/16 of an inch. That's all they need, 1/16 of an inch, and they're able to gain access. That's a wide open door for a tiny little termite worker. So what are some of the things that termites can eat? Well, obviously we know they can eat wood. They can eat other items as well. Items like paper, books, cardboard, particle board, basically anything that's going to be cellulose based. I also think it's important to clarify here that just because we may see damage or observe termites chewing through a material doesn't mean that it's consuming it, right? So termite mandibles are really important tools that they depend on for not only consumption, but these are tools that they depend on for construction as well. So we may have observed termites damaging or chewing through various structural elements or components such as plastic, tar paper, sheetrock, plumbing materials, foam. And so, yes, there may be damage to those things, but that is not considered a food source for termites. And if we do see them damaging them or chewing through them, it's typically done in the pursuit of wood, which is their food source. So we're going to take a look at some various items that do have termite damage. We're looking at a few examples of termite damaged books here. And books, of course, have paper. Paper is made from wood pulp, and wood pulp is derived from trees. And of course, they have an example on the left. This is a book that has a hardcover, and that hardcover is made from cardstock. And cardstock, like paper, is derived from wood pulp as well, which is made from trees. So this isn't a bad meal for a hungry termite, especially in severe infestations, and this is accessible. They may go for it. I'd be curious to know what are some of the unusual items and household things that you've seen in your career that had termite damage. If you come across stuff like this, try to get pictures. It's always good to have that photo evidence of the unusual things that termites will feed on. And that's a question that the entomologists at NPMA wanted to answer. And they actually put out a really interesting and fun series on the topic called Will They Eat It? And so the entomologists at the National Pest Management Association had this tank where they would put various household items, things like dictionaries, headphones, shoes, fast food orders, and they dumped 100,000, I think, termites or so on top of these various items, and then they'd come back to see which parts of those items did they consume or damage. And so I encourage you to get on YouTube and check that out. It's a really fun series, and that's my shameless plug. If you're not following NPMA or you're not subscribed to the Pest World YouTube channel, you may be missing out on some really fun, creative content that team puts out. So I encourage you to check it out. I'm also willing to bet that some of you have come across a situation like this where your customer grabs you by the hand and they run to a part of the exterior of their home and they point at something like this and they say, "What in the Sam Hill created this perfectly round hole in the exterior of my home? What caused this damage?" And in this particular case with this image here, it was the elusive 3/4 inch drill bit. I think part of being good at what we do, and this comes with time and it comes with experience, is learning what is actually insect evidence and what is not. Also learning what is actually insect damage and what is not. And that can be challenging in many cases. So the truth behind this myth is termites are consuming cellulosic materials. They're eating wood, paper, cardboard stock, all those various cellulosic materials in and around the structure. You're not going to find them feeding on brick, stone, or mortar. Okay, hopping along to myth number 4. If I find termites in the landscape, they're definitely in the structure too. Okay, so if I find termite activity in a pile of firewood in the backyard or the fence around my property, that means they're definitely in my home. Is that right? That's false, and thank goodness that's the case. When I was growing up, I grew up in Florida, we had a big cow pasture that backed up to our backyard. And in that cow pasture, there was a lot of really old oak trees. There was a barn, piles of wood. And I remember my parents saying that they saw termites coming from that pasture and they would blow over onto our property. And we had somebody come out just to make sure that there was nothing wrong with our house. And so these things can happen. And we want to take that information, we want to observe it during our inspections and take it as an early warning system and as a potential threat to the structure. But just because we see termites attacking these various things in the yard or around the property or other people's property near the structure doesn't mean that there's definitively an infestation actively attacking the structure at that time. That's something that we want to confirm when we're conducting our thorough inspection. So what are some of the wooden elements and things around the property that we're going to look for to determine if there's any activity in and around the structure? Well, you may look at, the pile of firewood or trees or landscape timbers. And in this case, we're looking at somebody's fence that wrapped around their backyard of their property. And it has very characteristic termite damage on this fence. Again, really important information for us to have when we're doing our inspection, but we just want to be cautious and careful not to jump to conclusions and make any assumptions about the status of the home or the structure until we've had the opportunity to go in and inspect it ourselves. When it comes to termite foraging, we're not 100% exactly sure how termites find and exploit a food source. There's a lot of science that's gone into understanding this aspect of termite behavior, and there's a little bit of variation with some of the research that's available. Some research suggests that they'll travel a few yards away from the main nest or colony, and then there's other research that suggests some species are willing to go several hundred yards away. And so what do we attribute this variation to? Well, as I mentioned already, it could potentially be the termite species. It could be the size or the structure of the colony. Smaller colonies may not be willing to travel as far for a food source as a larger one. And so we're going to talk about what some of the science says a little more in depth about this topic in the coming slides. Now, like other insects, termites communicate with their nestmates and with each other through the use of chemical messaging. Chemical messaging is pheromones, or the use of pheromones. And so when a termite forager finds a food source, they're not passing around maps and saying, go 100 meters east and you're going to hit the honey hole. What they do is if they found a good food source, they're going to deposit pheromone trails that lets their nestmates know, hey, come this way, I found something good. And as the other foragers follow that trail to the food source, they're also going to be depositing pheromone trails to strengthen that trail to let everyone know we got something good. Come check it out. Come forage on it. Now, this is a really important role within the colony because remember, there are different roles in a termite colony. You have your reproductives and your non-reproductives, and it's these foragers that are responsible for feeding the rest of the family that's back home in the nest, right? They have to effectively and efficiently be able to find food, collect that food, bring it back to feed the soldiers that are defending the nest. They got to feed the workers that are in the brood chamber taking care of the young, and then they got to feed the reproductives that are busy making and laying eggs. So it's really important that they have the ability to do this efficiently. Now, the intensity of that pheromone trail is going to be affected by several factors. It could be influenced by abiotic factors such as temperature and moisture. As you would expect, the hotter it is, the quicker those molecules are going to break down and dissipate. Also, how compacted the soil is going to affect the intensity of that pheromone trail. And also the size and the quality of the food source that they just found. Did they just hit the jackpot, or is it a small morsel or scrap of food? Okay, that's going to affect how intense that trail is that communicates to the others whether or not to go after it. Another interesting fact is sometimes there are termite species that can be seen foraging above ground, like the conehead termite, for instance. You can observe their nests and their tunnels in the grass, in the trees and shrubs. So there's quite a bit of variation in termite foraging behaviors between species as well. We do know that it's a collective process. Everybody's working together to achieve the same goal, and that's to ensure that the colony is fed and taken care of. Now, we do know that the termite workers have different responsibilities in some cases within the colony. Some are tasked with feeding on and collecting and harvesting the cellulose located within the nest, while others are tasked to harvest and collect food that is found away from the nest. It's really a fascinating process, how it's communicated, organized, and executed within a termite colony. And it's really important that once a food source has been depleted, that these foragers have the ability to locate and find new food sources. The success and the survival of the colony depends on that ability. But as I mentioned before, the scientific jury is still somewhat out as far as how this exactly happens within termites, how they locate that new food source. It's likely a combination of a few things, such as chemical cues, random foraging, moisture content, and edge trailing. And there's a lot of research that's being done in this area to understand this behavior within termites a little bit better. One of the publications that came out a few years ago in 2017 in the Journal of Economic Entomology, this was published by Dr. Nanyao Su and his associates and researchers at the University of Florida. And in this particular study, they wanted to evaluate the relationship between colony size and foraging distance within the Formosan subterranean termites. And what they found was, as you would expect, as long as the royal pair was present, the larger colonies were willing to forage a greater distance than the smaller ones. Another interesting finding from this study was that the older termites were the ones that were tasked to forage the furthest away from the central nest. So if you were wondering how termite colonies treat their geriatric nest members, now you know. Not so good. Put on your walking shoes, Betty. The truth behind this myth is if termites are found feeding on a fence, if they're found feeding nearby in a pile of wood or your neighbor's property, yes, it means there's activity and there is a colony nearby, but it does not mean that that colony is definitively feeding on the structure. Okay, so here's the first of the two attendance verification slides that we have in today's presentation. This is one of the CEU requirements that we have to meet. So on this little text box, you want to type in that code word now. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. We're going to have one more of these slides a little later in the presentation. Okay, hopefully everybody's had an opportunity to type in the word mandible into that text box. I don't think spelling matters, but hopefully you got it right there. Moving along to myth number 5. Termites are easy to find when they're infesting a structure. Okay, buddy. If you do termite work, which I imagine many of you joining me here today do, you know that this is simply not true, or else termite inspections would be a lot easier. Termites are known as silent destroyers for a reason. They have that reputation for a reason. And that's because they're cryptic, they're very good at hiding, and these organisms can gain access to structures through the teeny tiniest of openings. In addition to this, a lot of the species we deal with are subterranean, right? They're quietly tunneling away in their underground tunnels and galleries and mud tubes, right? They're protected from the heat and the light of day. So it can be quite challenging to find any evidence of their presence. It takes time to find termite activity. It takes time to notice that evidence. What are some of the things that we're looking for in and around a structure? This is by no means comprehensive, but a few things that we're looking for include shelter tubes that are found visible on the foundation wall, We're looking for tiny, minuscule pinholes in the drywall, like the one here. Very clear evidence of termites within the wall there. We're looking for alates in the window. We're looking for frass piles. We're looking for damage to baseboards. These are all things that could be very, very easy to walk right by if you weren't paying careful attention. And so if you look closely at this baseboard, at first glance, it may look like everything's fine. But upon closer examination, you may be able to see some fine lines, some grooves. It may appear like it's the grain of the wood, but it's really not. You can see there's tiny holes and openings in that paint layer where those lines and those grooves are. And it's essentially just that outer paint layer that's holding it up. You can push your thumb through some of those soft spots and push right through that baseboard because of the severe damage on the other side. Somebody would miss this, but we know our eyes are trained to look for things like this. And that's an indicator of termite activity and a presence. So as we mentioned, they can gain entry into a structure through the smallest of openings, the smallest entry points. In some cases, there are various structural elements and structural components that are more susceptible to termite attack and penetration. And some of those structural components can make inspection especially difficult. Things like bath traps, plumbing penetrations, and construction flaws that could potentially be inviting termite activity. So not only do we have to deal with all of these things, but sometimes it's the personal decision and the personal items that belong to the homeowner that also can interfere with our ability to conduct a thorough and a fluid inspection, right? I'm sure you've seen it before where there's mulch stacked up clear over that foundation line, or you have a deck that's been built and it's covering that foundation area. It's impossible for you to be able to see that space that you need to look at to determine if there's any mud tubes or termite activity. Sometimes it's large personal items that are in the way that you have to hassle with or move to be able to see what's going on. And not to mention extreme situations where you have hoarding or clutter and it's almost impossible to conduct an inspection in those type situations. And depending on what part of the country you're joining us from, you may also have to deal with homes that have been sprayed with spray foam insulation, and that can add a huge layer of challenge because that material is completely covering and coating the structural timbers that we need to be able to look at to determine whether or not there's any termite activity. So how do people know that they have termites? Well, they see them. They observe a swarming event. They may not know exactly what they're looking at, but they know they need to call you. They may see damage or other evidence like the swarm castle that was built here on this kitchen island underneath that Formica ledge. Again, they may not know what that is, but they know that they need to call somebody who does. I love to share this story here because it's 100% true, and it really illustrates just how valuable our information is and how valuable our knowledge is. The general public really doesn't know. And it's a story about my sister. She's very intelligent. She's a teacher in Florida, and she's hated bugs her whole life. She was the kind of kid that would scream her lungs out if there was a ladybug in the car. And I think at 30 years old, she probably acts in the same way. Not much has changed there. Well, she called me one day and said, Heather, there are bugs all over the school. They're inside the school. They're outside the school. They're on the playgrounds, on the recess field. And she said that her students would ask her, Miss Erskine, what are all these bugs? And she told them they were baby dragonflies, because that's what she thought they were. And I didn't have time to get into the dragonfly life cycle, but I'm like, Lindsay, those are not dragonflies, but if you take a picture and send it to me, maybe we can figure out what it is. And sure enough, it was Formosan subterranean termites that had taken over her school in Florida. So I share this story because even when somebody is face to face or eye to eye with a termite, sometimes they have no clue what it is. So what do you see here? Right? To the untrained eye, there may not be anything super suspicious in this image. Some of you may have picked it out right off the bat, but if you look closely over here, you'll see that these subterranean termites have cryptically nestled their foraging tube or their mud tube in the crack of this existing crack between the stucco. And the soil and the material that they use to build their tube kind of blends in nicely with its surroundings. So this could be very difficult to see. You're in a crawl space. You don't have much room. You don't have the best lighting. It's very easy to miss these subtle things in the environment that let us know, hey, we got a termite problem. As the old saying goes, if this was the snake, it might want to bit you. So what do we see here? Okay, we're looking at this entryway. We have a couple of doors. We can see where the wall meets the ceiling in that corner. The termite infestation within the walls is starting to show signs of its presence, right? They've built these swarm castles, and we know what they are. This is the evidence that we're looking for, but the average person may see that and be like, is that a mud dauber? I don't know, I'm gonna knock it down with my broom and go about my day. So these are very subtle things that we know to keep our eye open for, to figure out what's the extent of the activity in a given area. And so, of course, these are swarm castles that they build where the alates will funnel out of as they go on and take wing on their reproductive flights. What about here? Now, this is a picture of an awning or this ledge that overhung this deck area of this two-story home in Houston. And you can see that stucco finish, which is a very popular exterior finish for homes, has cracked, has openings in it. And a homeowner could see something like this and be like, oh, my stucco is damaged. I need to get that patched up and fixed. But we know, I don't know how clear it is on your side, on your screen, but if you look closely enough, there's shelter material, there's soil, there's frass packed in those little openings and cracks, very indicative of a termite problem. And that's what was happening here. There was a Formosan subterranean carton nest that had established in this awning over this family's back deck, and it was going to town. Even on the inside, if you went on the inside of where this awning met the second story, around the window, there were little subtle signs that say, we've got a termite problem. So the truth behind this myth is it's very, very easy to miss termite evidence. We're looking for tiny, minuscule little things in the environment, those mud tubes, the alates, the frass, the cracks, the bubbling on the wallpaper. They're cryptic creatures, and that's why we have to be especially careful and especially thorough when we're conducting our inspections, because it'd be easy to miss. Termites are very good at hiding. That's their MO, their modus operandi. That's how they protect themselves from potential threats or predators, and that includes us, the PMPs. Okay, I gotta hop along here. I'm taking too long. Myth number 6, termites in a structure mean that there's definitely structural damage. Okay. What say you? Plot twist. I'm throwing you for a loop on this one. This actually can be true, especially if we're talking about invasive termite species that have a voracious appetite and can cause a significant amount of damage in a short amount of time. This is a question that we get often. Well, how much wood can a termite eat? How much wood can a colony eat? What's the damage potential? And this is a completely hypothetical example because there's a lot of variables that affect that answer, right? And so let's just talk through some points of this hypothetical example where we first need to determine, well, how much wood does the average termite eat per day? It's somewhere around 0.08 milligrams of wood per termite per day. Teeny bits of wood, right? Fractions of a milligram is what we're talking about. Now, things become quite significant when we're talking about an entire colony. How much wood can an entire colony eat? Well, that's going to depend. Are we dealing with a native subterranean termite species or an invasive species like the Formosans? Because they're going to have very different colony sizes. The average native subterranean termite colony is going to have somewhere around 200,000 workers. For Formosans, that number is easily doubled, somewhere around 500,000. And we know that it can get up into the several millions in some cases for well-established populations. So when we're talking about an entire colony, how much wood can be not eaten in a day's time, but a month, a year, when you have something like 500,000 termites, that can be quite substantial. There's also differences in feeding behaviors between native subs and invasive subterranean termites. We consider native subterranean termites more like nibblers. They're not going to completely deplete a food source to the bones. And that's not the case for Formosans. They're known to do that. They'll typically utilize a food source till it's completely gone. There is so much that we're still learning about these organisms. There's a lot of fascinating research that's still being conducted. A lot of publications that are still coming out. Research that seeks to answer questions like, well, what happens during a disastrous colony split-off event? How does the colony respond to the loss of those foragers and those workers? Well, this was an article published last year in Scientific Reports, and they wanted to evaluate and determine how that colony would respond when those old workers were removed on a weekly basis from the feeding site. And what they found was those old workers, those older foragers, were replaced with younger foragers, and the colony sought to maintain the same worker proportions at those food sites. And the younger workers they weren't able to eat the same volume as their older siblings. And so there was a significant decrease in the consumption rate with those younger workers. But the colony's goal, they sought to maintain that proportion. And so there's still a lot of things that we're learning about termite feeding behaviors, foraging behaviors, and there's a lot of really interesting and useful science that is coming out on a regular basis about these topics. So we're talking about termite damage potential. We know that they are a very important pest, a very economically important pest, because the amount of damage that they cause on an annual basis. And so you can get online really quick and Google termite damage, and you're going to see a number of articles that have been published recently that speak on this. So this was one that I found in a quick search that was put out by a Mobile, Alabama news station just a few weeks ago, posted on February 15th, and it reads, "Termite damage creating costly repairs at the Haven." It's been home to Fairhope's no-kill animal shelter for more than 20 years, but since 2020, termites have continued causing problems at the Haven. Now, we've kind of seen the extent of the damage, and there's no fixing it without taking the front off the building and rebuilding it, said Fairhope Public Works Director Richard Johnson. Johnson says crews will knock out the front exterior wall where termites have taken over. At a cost of approximately $150,000, that portion of the building will be rebuilt and stronger materials will be used to correct other issues. And so again, you can find things like this all the time about the damage that termites can cause and the headaches that they can cause for a lot of people all around the country. So it's a reminder of how important the work is that we do in helping to protect people's biggest investments from these destructive organisms. So the truth behind this myth: termites work very effectively, very efficiently, and when we're talking about those invasive species, they can cause a significant amount of damage to a structure in a relatively short amount of time. Myth 7, all termites eat wood. What do we think about this? That's not true. There are somewhere over 3,000 termite species, and many of them are not eating wood. So what are they feeding on? Let's talk about the diet of termites globally. What are some of the things that they're eating on in various regions around the world? We do know, of course, we have the termite species that will feed and consume wood and cellulose, but there's other species, especially if we're talking about higher termites and lower termites. Some of those termites are going to be feeding on things like soil, leaf litter, decaying plants, and even animal dung. And we're talking about the species that live in subtropical regions specifically. Those termites are considered to be very important detritivores. A fancy word drop, a detritivore is an organism that eats organic material, and in this case, it's specifically decaying plant matter. And so, again, this is a very important role that termites have, because these are things that not a lot of organisms are equipped to break down. Yeah, soil, leaf litter, animal dung, we don't consider that very good food sources for many organisms, but termites do it well. They're able to recycle these nutrients back into the environment. It's a good opportunity to talk about agricultural termites. These termites are native to the United States. I'm presenting to you today from Houston, Texas. They are found here in Texas and other southern states as well. Agricultural termites are going to be predominantly found in rural areas. They're going to be found in pastures, especially in places where grass is grown either for grazing or for hay production. What are they feeding on? Well, we're talking about termites that don't feed on wood. So they don't feed on wood. They do feed on grasses, forbs, and weeds. They're consuming that soft plant tissue. And since they're subterranean termites, they'll build their shelter tube, very characteristic, looks very similar to what we've seen for structure invading termite species. They'll build that shelter soil material around their plants, around the grass that they're feeding on. And if you didn't know what to look for, it could be very easy to confuse these termites with our native subterranean termites, or even Formosan subterranean termites that are important for structural pest management, because they do have a similar appearance. So here is an example or a picture of these agricultural termites that live in the soil that are feeding on the grasses, the weeds, and the vegetation. They've built that shelter material around their food source. Again, they're eating grass, not wood, so they're not considered a structural pest. Here's what one looks like. Here's a soldier, and at first glance, it could look like one of the soldiers of the termite species we deal with. But if you look closely, especially at the picture on the right, you'll see that there is a tooth on those mandibles, and that tooth is very indicative of an agricultural termite. You're not going to see that tooth on our native subs or our Formosan subterranean termites. So the truth here is termites, yes, they consume wood, but there's a lot of species that are consuming other items as well, such as detritus, grass, leaf litter, and organic matter, and even animal dung. All right, myth number 8. Termites are not a pest in northern cold climates. Okay, well, we can tell pretty right off the bat with this distribution map that that's not the case. What we're looking at here is an illustration of the areas around the United States that are going to be most vulnerable to termite attack, infestation potential, have the greatest termite pressure. And as you would expect, those southern states that are warmer, that are more humid, are going to have the greatest infestation potential. States like California, East Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, and Georgia. And as we move north, that pressure greatly decreases. But you can see most states around the country are going to have either very high or slight to moderate termite infestation potential or presence. So 49 of our 50 states are going to have termites. Okay, if you look closely at that map, I'll flip back to it. Yes, even the frigid state of Maine has a teeny tiny sliver of slight to moderate termite pressure and presence. If you want to live in a state in the United States free of termite attack, you're going to have to move to Alaska. And so those northern states can experience some pretty extreme weather situations, extremely cold temperatures, heavy snowfall, freezing events, and it is stressful for termites. What they end up doing is they'll end up retreating deeper into the soil where the conditions are much more favorable and stable, and they'll actually stop feeding and stop foraging at that point. They kind of go into survival mode. So for termites that are living in these northern climates, we don't typically see them spreading or establishing via swarming events. Most often they're either moving via migration or fragmentation. And those extreme weather events in those normal climates can actually cause a lot of significant things or issues for termites, such as entire population die-offs. We've observed limitation of foraging or the complete stop of foraging for these termites that live in those areas. And then also, as I mentioned, they'll move deeper into the soil where things are much more stable. Ultimately, if the colony is able to replace the winter losses that they experienced in the next spring or the summer, the colony can survive. But it is harsh. And then what do, right? If it's harsh conditions, whether it's in the north or south, if things are too hot, we're going to cool it down. If things are too cold, we're going to warm it up. Climate control. Humans, we're affecting our own ecosystems, and in some cases that can benefit the pests, right? It can provide the insects or other pests an island where they can escape from or survive through those harsh environmental conditions. So as we learned, yes, termite pressure is going to be heaviest in the south, but they do exist in northern states where the climate is much colder. Okay, we've got to the point of the presentation where we're going to do our second attendance verification slide. Please type in that code word into the text box now. Okay. Hopefully everybody's had a chance to get that one typed in, cellulose. We're going to move on to the next myth. Myth number 9. Myth number 9 is once I treat a house, all termites die. Customers will not see termites anymore. That is false. It's not entirely uncommon for customers to call us up reporting that they've observed a swarming event even after you've conducted a successful termiticide treatment or application. I do want to preface and say that many of the termiticides that we have been rigorously tested. They do have, in some cases, a lifespan anywhere between 8 to 10 years. So what are swarms? Swarms are going to indicate continued termite activity, continued termite presence, potentially in the structure or around the structure, right? There's termite activity somewhere, it's coming from somewhere, and it's good to figure out what that source is. Sometimes it can be untreated areas of the structure, or it could be something in the neighbor's yard or the backyard, other sources of cellulose in and around the property. The fact of the matter is that swarms have been observed to occur up to 6 weeks following an effective termiticide application, right? And so why does this happen? That's something that we want to understand here. Well, when we think about the termite alates, when they're produced, remember they have those swarm castles that they're moving towards. Sometimes they can separate themselves from the main colony or the main nest, and that separation can separate them from exposure to the termiticide active ingredients and treatment. And so this is something to consider when we're doing our application or we're communicating with our customers, just to set that expectation and ease any concerns that they may have, because swarming events following an application is not entirely uncommon. A lot of the termiticides that we have available to us are non-repellent formulations. They're not going to deliver an instantaneous kill of termites, and they were designed to be slow acting for a very important reason, and that's because we want to give that material time to work its way through the colony to affect the colony. Some products, even the ones that contain fipronil, can take up to 90 days to achieve 100% control. Really important to not get discouraged or assume that your product failed. It just sometimes takes some time. Also, be careful not to assume that your termite treatment is going to last forever either. You know, a lot of products, including Taurus SC, have demonstrated 8 or more years of efficacy, but there's various factors in the soil that can affect or change that residual or that longevity. And once that active ingredient is broken down and that termiticide barrier is gone and no longer effective, the structure is susceptible to continued attack. And when that happens, it's important that we perform additional treatments to continue to deliver protection to that structure. Okay, that's why it's really important that we stay diligent with our regular inspections to ensure that there is no renewed termite activity in those spaces. The truth is, even after an effective termiticide treatment, slow-acting formulations may take some time to see results. Okay, myth number 10, my lot was cleared completely of trees and other vegetation before my house was built. Termites left to find food elsewhere and are no longer in the area. That is not true. Just because we remove trees, those above ground food sources, doesn't mean that we've eliminated the termites. Take a look at this picture. This lot is being prepped for construction. No termites were harmed in the clearing of this lot. And then what do? We DoorDash their favorite meal. Those termites are still there, living underground where there's plenty of food, tree and plant roots, other cellulose, and then we start to build of their favorite food. So I'm getting close to having to wrap up here. I'm going to maybe hopefully get to one more myth. The truth behind this one is subterranean termites can live underground and persist in environments where even when the lot has been cleared of vegetation. Okay. All right, myth number 11, termites are soft, weak, vulnerable little organisms that can't defend themselves. This is not true. They have a huge biomass and they've been around for a very long time. These are very successful organisms with unique forms of defense. They are, I don't usually like to break this down, but for the sake of time, what we're looking at is a geological time scale. We're somewhere at the very top in the Cenozoic era, which represents recent life. From 66 million years ago to today. And so you can see the various animal groups that are still hanging on today, and then the ones that have since extinct, somewhere between the Paleogene and the Cretaceous period. Where did the termites arise? Somewhere here in the Jurassic period of the Mesozoic era. And it's characterized by warm, hot, wet climate. It's perfect termite climate. And that's what we see happen during this time period. They have a variety of mechanisms to defend themselves. We're very familiar with the mandibles that can crush and pierce their enemies. Some have mandibles that can snap and deliver a powerful strike and blow to any predators or enemies. You have some unusual ones like this guy that has a plug-like head that they can use to prevent entry into the nest. You have ones like these conehead termites that can secrete defensive noxious secretions, a very effective form of defense. And then we even have exploding worker termites, right? This is very fascinating stuff. Even the workers can help defend the colony. They have these materials in their back. If you saw in that picture, they're somewhat blue looking, and they can expand that part of their body when they're agitated or threatened, and it can end up bursting toxic liquid onto the enemy, the ant, whoever's attacking it to defend itself. It's essentially a self-sacrifice for the betterment and the safety of the colony. So we have made it to the hour here, and I'm going to jump ahead because I don't want to waste anybody's time. I didn't get to, it looks like 2 myths here, and I had to scoot through myth number 11. So sorry I got a little long-winded, but I'm going to try to jump to the end and find my conclusion slide. Okay, I'm going to leave you with these 4 points here. The first point is pest management requires skills like critical thinking, patience, and diligence. These are skills that are going to be helpful for any pest management situation that you find yourself in, whether it's ants, termites, small flies, whatever the case may be. It's really important, number 2, that we don't fall for common myths. We want to be able to fact check, don't believe everything that you hear or that you read, and we want to do our own research sometimes to confirm that. You have a lot of really reliable resources of information that are here in this industry for you, not just manufacturing reps, but also distributor reps. You have your state associations, national associations, you have your university extension offices, and then even your Department of Ag. All of us are here to make sure we're all doing things appropriately and effectively together. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Danielle. I thank you for your time and your attention today, and I apologize for not getting to all the myths that I wanted to share with you.
Thanks so much, Heather. Now we'll jump into some questions, though. So if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask, you can drop them into the Q&A panel. We'll get started with a couple that we got during the presentation and during registration. So Heather, first question for you. What is the main difference between a termite invasion and a termite infestation?
So this could arguably come down to semantics. My opinion for this one is I would say that an invasion describes a situation where we may have unwanted or unwelcomed intrusion of termites. Yes, there are termites that are observed in that area, but it may not necessarily imply that they've established there. But when we use the word infestation, I think that implies pretty clearly that the termites have established in that area or space or structure.
Perfect. Thank you. Another question. How long does it take a subterranean termite colony to fully mature?
I'm pretty sure for both native subterranean termites and for Formosan subterranean termites, it can take somewhere around 3 to 5 years for that colony to mature. And we kind of define colony maturity as when they're producing alates of their own. And it's somewhere around that 3 to 5 mark. It's continuing that cycle, producing reproductives and alates to go out and form their own colonies. And when that happens, I think populations in that colony are somewhere, depending on the species, between 200 termites all the way up to, 200,000 termites up to 400,000 termites. So it depends on the species, but I think 3 to 5 years for natives and Formosan subs.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Oh, what areas should I pay attention to when performing an inspection?
This is a really good question, and what I share is by no means going to be comprehensive. I do think there's some obvious places that we want to pay careful attention to, such as the foundation of the home. We want to look for areas around the structure that have a lot of dense vegetation, that have a lot of foliage. Also areas that may be low-lying, that collect water because of drainage issues. We want to look for things maybe on the exterior wall, like panels or fuse boxes, electrical boxes that could be a potential infestation point for termites as well. When we're talking about coming into the inside, we want to look at expansion joints. We want to take a look at those plumbing penetrations, especially in the bathroom. Find that bath trap, get our eyes on it. We want to look for any blistering or unusual bubbling on the wall. And so there's a list that you probably should be able to make when you're conducting your inspection of things that you want to make sure you look at. If there's a pool, is there wood around that pool that's going to get splashed on, or that has a lot of water damage to it? These are things that we want to look at to help bolster our confidence in our inspection and get a good idea of the situation as a whole.
Great. Thanks, Heather. One final question, and then we'll wrap up today's event with some few reminders. Could you share how much damage is done per year by termites?
Yeah, so the estimations are actually quite substantial. I think each year termites are damaging more than 500,000 homes every year around the country. I actually think it's closer to 600,000 homes on an annual basis. And what that equates to in dollars is somewhere around $5 billion in damage between the termite services and also the cost for repair because of these destructive organisms.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you so much. And thanks for a great presentation today. Now we'll wrap up the live event and share some reminders with everybody. So a quick reminder for those of you attending for CEUs, those who have indicated that during registration, you must have supplied your license number and you will receive a quiz via email. And you must complete the quiz by the deadline provided in that email. So more information will be provided then. I also want to let you know that if you had to view the entire webinar in its full duration live, it will be available for on-demand viewing. We'll send out an email about that next week, but that will not count for CEU credits. So I want to thank everyone for attending Termite Myths and Lies, brought to you by Pest Management Professional Magazine and our sponsor, Control Solutions, Inc. If we were not able to answer your questions during the presentations or the Q&A session, your questions will be forwarded to the speaker to be addressed via email. And then any follow-up questions about the webinar itself and the content, you can direct those here to Heather. Her email is on the slide that you see now. And then if you have any specific questions about CEU credits, you can direct those to Trinity. She is also the one who should have received your photo from New York and New Jersey and your license information, which she will get from registration. Again, those emails are on the screen now. Upcoming webinars from Pest Management Professional will be posted to mypmp.net/webinars. And we want to thank you all for attending, and we hope you'll join us again soon for another great webinar.